Okay. All right. Hey, welcome everyone. We are going to go through the Torah. We just recently finished the book of Matthew, and we're now moving on into the Torah. What is the Torah? That's the question. Think about that. We'll pray, and then we'll get started. Lord, thank you so much for this new day. Thank you for your word, Lord. Thank you that your word instructs us in how to live. And we thank you that we have the opportunity to teach and to study through the first 5 books of your word. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, we're going to do something a little bit different today. We are going to get into Genesis, but we're going to kind of take our time getting there. What I want to do is go through the Torah in the next year. All right, and there's something called the parasha, or the Torah portion of the week. We will be going along that schedule, and it kind of moves along. So we're not going to have a lot of time to go through like we normally do, verse by verse by verse, but we will go through, and of course we'll have to highlight a few things. But because there is so much that really is entailed with this whole thing, and because as Gentiles we're sort of out of the loop, I want to take a little extra time to get us into this notion of the Torah. All right, so the Torah, what is the Torah? The Torah is the first 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. All right, so that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those are the first 5 books. And sometimes it's called the Pentateuch, but it's more properly called the Torah. Sometimes the Jews call it the Chumash, which just means 5. And so does Pentateuch, means 5. All right. So we're just talking about these first 5 books of Moses. Why are the first 5 books so important? Well, just like a foundation of a building is so important, because everything else is built upon that. If you go back and you look in the prophets, what are they calling people to do? To go back to God's Torah. Right? What do we see in the Psalms generally? They're talking about how wonderful your law is, which is the word Torah. Right? And it's all based on the instructions that God gave in specifically the book of Exodus and, of course, Leviticus. That is really the heart and soul of the instruction book of God. Now, the word Torah, it's often translated as law or nomos in the Greek. And that is really unfortunate, because the word law is not at all the best translation for the word Torah. Torah comes from the idea of to teach, to instruct, but it actually goes back further. The word yara actually means to take aim or to shoot. It's like to shoot an arrow. All right, so you have this idea of aiming for something, and that's the basis of the word Torah. Okay, the word moreh, which is teacher, is related to that same word. Now, thinking about this idea of hitting the mark, you might have heard this sermon before, that the word sin comes from the word, it's in Hebrew, it's chet or chata, and it means to miss the mark. Okay, so if Torah is related to this idea of shooting an arrow to hit a mark, and sin is missing the mark, then that means that sin is not observing the instructions of God, not observing the Torah of God. It's really very, very simple. And unfortunately, somehow we have made it incredibly complicated. If we look at 1 John 3:4, it says, whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. That's the New King James. In the Greek, it's the anomia, which is literally lawlessness. Some translations say transgression of the law. But the idea is that sin is lawlessness. So what is the law? It's the Torah of God. It's the instructions that God has given. So again, to miss the mark is to not keep the Torah. And this is why it's become so incredibly important for us to know what the Torah is all about. Now think about this. If you're going to become a driver, you need to study the driver manual. Let's call it the instruction booklet. You need to know that thing. You study it, you get quizzed on it, you take a test, you take a driver's test, right? And the first time you go out onto the freeway, man, you are scared as can be, and so is your instructor. Right? It's a life and death situation for him. He's like, I could die today, right? He's got that extra brake, but it may not do any good, okay? And this is because the instruction manual is not yet fully integrated into your soul. But after you've driven for a couple years or even less, it quickly starts to take root in you, and you don't need to carry that thing with you anymore. And that's why you have to get a license to drive, because it's very important that you know how to do it and that it becomes second nature. Because a lot of times you have only a split second to make a decision. In fact, when I'm merging lanes, I look in my rear mirror, I look in both mirrors, and then I also turn and I look back here, because experience has taught me, but I also learned it in my driving school, that there's a blind spot. And if I don't look, I might look in my mirrors and not see anybody, but I need to look back here too, because there might be a car there. In fact, I was driving back from Riverside a couple weeks ago, and I looked in my mirror, nobody there. And I thought, well, I better look just in case. And whoa, there was somebody right there, because I was thinking, oh, maybe I'll just pull over, but I'm like, oh, I better look, right? Experience has taught me, and the instruction book taught me that I need to look, all right? So because I took that precaution, guess what? My life was probably spared that day. At the very least, my car was spared, right? So I didn't suffer property damage. I didn't suffer any kind of physical damage or even potentially death. So what I learned in driving school and in the driving manual saved me a lot of pain. It was for my good that they taught me to look back this way, to not always trust my mirrors, but to take a second look, because there could be something there. And that's what the instructions of God are all about. Think of maybe a pilot's manual. You want your pilot to have that thing internalized, don't you? You don't want it to be up there flipping through the pages. Now what do I do? Let's say I got to hit this button, and then I got to hit that button. And what do I do? Now, a lot of times a pilot, at least the one that I flew with, he had his license and everything, but he still went through the book because it's so easy to forget things. There's a lot of steps involved. So even though he was a licensed pilot, he was required to still go through the check booklet. Now, he wasn't learning to fly from that, but it was a basic list of what to do. And so the Torah is really multifaceted. It gives us the in-depth, detailed instructions, but it also gives us kind of just a really quick summary, what you're supposed to do in any given situation. It takes it to the big principle, love the Lord, love your neighbor, and then it drills down to the specifics of what that looks like. And if we throw that out, then we'll never know if we actually hit the mark or if we miss the mark. You see? And what Western Christianity has done by and large is they've said that, well, we are no longer under the law. We don't care about any of that stuff. We're under the new covenant. It's, we're New Testament Christians. The law of Moses has no place in our lives. In fact, Jesus took that and he nailed it to the cross. And so now you're like, well, so what is sin? In fact, I was picking up my son from a class he was in, and they were talking about sin. And it was on the whiteboard, what is sin? And it says, not pleasing God. And I'm like, oh, it's true, but I said, well, there's a really easy definition. It's in 1 John 3:4, right? That sin is lawlessness. And his teacher said, well, what's law? And I was like, well, gee, do I want to get into a debate with her right here in front of my kids? I don't know. I said, well, it's to love the Lord and love your neighbor. And she's like, well, yeah, okay. If I had said any more, I probably would have gotten into a debate, right? If I had to say, well, it's the 10 Commandments, suddenly the red flags start to go up around people. Like, oh no, that's the Old Testament. We're not doing that. See? But God, we're going to see tonight that God really thinks highly of his Torah. And shouldn't he? I mean, he is the creator. He knows what is good and what is not. He knows what leads to life and what leads to death. And if he's given us his instruction booklet, shouldn't we take that seriously? Shouldn't we consider it to live by it and to be blessed by it? God gave it to us because he wants us to be blessed. So really, there's all kinds of manuals, instruction booklets. You have a nurse's manual, a heavy equipment manual, and the list goes on and on and on of things that you need to learn. You got to study them, and those are a tutor to you, those manuals, until it becomes second nature. It becomes so easy. You don't have to go back and look in the instruction booklet. So the Torah, the law of Moses, is the instruction booklet that we learn from. We meditate on it day and night. As Joshua says, we're going to meditate on that day and night so that it becomes part of us. We're going to hide that in our heart. And that's why God says, this book of the law shall not depart from you, but you shall meditate on it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. You see, if you want to be a successful driver, what do you need to do? You need to study the manual. You need to know it, know what to do in a situation, right? You need to know that, when you come to a four-way stop sign, who has the right of way? If you don't do that, it could cause an accident. You need to know that when you come to a red light, you need to stop, right? Again, if you don't, it could cause an accident, maybe death. And this is really what God has given us. He's given us his instruction booklet that leads to life if we keep it. He says, for then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Guess what? The Lord wants us to be successful. He really does. This notion that he wants us to be poor, and I don't mean that people are never poor. I'm not into the social, whatever the gospel, the health, wealth kind of stuff. But, to some extent, okay, I'm not saying that we're all going to be, multimillionaires, because there's a lot of people that abuse that. But what I'm saying is that if we follow God's instructions, we will have a certain level of success. It might involve money. That'd be great. It might involve relationships. Could involve your work. Could involve all of those things. All right? And it could be that we were born into a family that our parents did not observe certain laws, and their parents didn't observe certain laws, and their parents. And so now we're carrying on this tradition of not observing certain laws. And that's why there's conflict and strife and great challenges in our families, because at some point we're not doing what God told us to do. It doesn't in any way invalidate the instructions that God has given us. Okay? And another thing we need to understand is that never, ever, ever does the Bible ever say that by keeping the law you can be saved. It never says that. It never says that. And it's funny because I used to have these debates with this anti-missionary woman. And, one day I said to her, I said, well, a Jewish anti-missionary from Israel, very sharp, knows the New Testament really well, okay? And I said, well, you guys think that you have to keep the law in order to be saved. And she said to me, no, we don't. We don't think that. I said, well, yes, you do. I know better than they do, right? And she says, no, we don't. She says, we keep the law because God told us to. Because we already have a relationship with God. And I was kind of dumbfounded for a minute. I was like, well, wait a second. You're not keeping it in order to score points and get to heaven. No. Like, this is amazing. Because, you know, what I had heard, what I was taught, is that your average Orthodox Jew, I'm not talking about the completely apostate, secular Jews, okay? I'm talking about the religious ones that are observing the Torah, okay? That they were keeping it in order to try to earn their salvation. But they're not. See, it'd be like saying to a child who's adopted, well, you're just doing what your father says because you want to be part of the family. And the kid would say, what are you talking about? I already am part of the family. I do what my father tells me to do because I love him. And he told me to do it. See, that's the difference of keeping the Torah. All right. Now, we're going to see that the Torah is more than sort of the do's and the don'ts. We have the book of Genesis, which in Hebrew is Bereshit, means the beginning or in the beginning. And, of course, then it's followed by the book of Shmot, which is Exodus, followed by Vayikra, which is Leviticus. Then comes Bamidbar, which is Numbers, and then Dvarim, which is Deuteronomy. So Bereshit is in the beginning. Shmot is names. Leviticus or Vayikra is and he said. Bamidbar is in the desert. And then Dvarim is words or things. It's kind of the same word. Word and thing is the same in Hebrew. So those are the different names that we have. So those encompass what we call the Torah or the Pentateuch. Now, to some extent, we can talk about the Torah being really all of God's word, okay? Because, you know, where good instructions go beyond what we find there. We find great instruction in the Psalms. We find great instructions in the prophets. Certainly in the book of Proverbs, we find good instruction. So when we talk about Torah, we can sort of use this global umbrella to talk about really anything that's God's word. But more specifically, we're talking about the first 5 books of Moses. Those are really the Torah. And we don't have a lot of outright laws in the book of Genesis, or let's call them instructions. Be careful your phone here. Of instructions. What we find is we find that we're going to have really the foundation of how we got to where we are. Right? And the first 11 chapters of Genesis move along at lightning speed. I mean, it's just, we cover so much ground in so few chapters. But the point is to get us up to this relationship that God starts with Abraham. It's from there on, it's God dealing with Abraham and his descendants and how God would bless him and his descendants forever. That becomes the topic of the rest of the Bible, right? And it's a big topic, right? And so once you begin to see that the centrality of this whole thing is Abraham and the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so then as a Gentile, that we are grafted into that covenant, that we get to become part of that. It's not the other way around. God didn't get rid of all that stuff. Well, that was the Old Testament. No. It's the same. The Abrahamic covenant is still in force, by the way.
So are we a descendant of Abraham?
No questions. Okay, so we become part of the nation of Israel. Okay, we become part of the nation of Israel. We're going to get into that as we go along. Okay, there's obviously a lot to talk about, but I want to impress upon you the word Torah. Okay, I want to impress upon you the word Torah. So, unfortunately, it has been translated as law for so long. But I want to take a look at some words, some passages, and then we're going to substitute the word law for instruction, and we're going to see that it has a different nuance. It's going to feel a little bit nicer, I think, because instead of it, I think of law, I think of, man, you got to do this or you're in massive trouble and the police are going to come after you and you'll be in trouble with the IRS or whatever because it's a law. Or instead of instructions, like something the instruction book that comes with your new phone, or the instruction book that comes with your microwave, or the instruction book that comes with taking a class telling you how to do it, so that if you follow the instructions, you will succeed in that venture. If you do it according to the way they tell you to do it, then this is going to happen. It's natural consequence if you follow the method that they're telling you to follow. If you don't, then things totally go awry. Okay, so we need to take a look at, so Exodus 12:49. Exodus 12:49. One law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. So here the word for law is the Torah. So think about this. If instead of thinking about this as this law, but let's think about it as one instruction shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. In other words, there isn't like one set of instructions for this group, another set of instructions for this group, but these instructions are universal. They're true for whoever is there. They're true for whoever is there. We also have in Exodus 13:9, and it says, "It shall be a sign to you on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's instructions may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt." Okay, again, it's the good things that God has told you and that he wants you to remember. We have in Exodus 16, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them, that they will walk in my instruction or not." You know, again, it's really, you're the coach of a team, okay? And you tell your players, I mean, you've got just tons of experience. You know what you're talking about, okay? You are telling your team how to do it. When you observe them and you see that, you know, these guys are really doing what I tell them to do. And these guys over here, not that they can't do it, but they won't do it. They're not practicing the things that I've told them to do. I've talked to them about it. Hey guys, what are you doing? Well, we don't really feel that way, coach. Oh, okay. All right. So come game day, who are you going to put up there on the floor? You're going to put the people that were doing what you told to do, right? Because they are following your instructions. You know how to play a game. These guys are pretty green, right? They've got some talent, but they're still pretty green in the whole thing, and they're going to do the things the way they want to do it. Well, you bench that guy. Well, you're just not going to play it because I have a strategy. I've been playing this for 30 years. I know how to play basketball, you might say. And you are pretty young and inexperienced. Okay, yeah, you can jump, but what else can you do? All right. So again, God is giving us his instruction, and here he's going to see, are you guys going to do what I say or not? It's the word Torah. It's the word Torah. 16:28, same chapter. And notice here, it says, I'll start in verse 25. Then Moses said, Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will be none. Now it happened that some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? You see, when we make a distinction between the word command and law, now where the word law and Torah, okay, now you got to look at these commandments, things he's telling you to do, and his instruction, Torah, his instructions. And so here again, the Lord specifically told the people what to do, how to do it, because he was going to bless them. He's going to give them a double portion on Friday so that they wouldn't have to go on Saturday. It's not that they didn't know what to do. It's that they were rebelling against what they had been told to do. This is Torah. Torah is God's good word to us. It's his instructions. His instructions. And of course, the list of these goes on and on and on, and what we're supposed to do. You have instructions about how to prepare the animals in the temple. Just like if you are a farmer and somebody comes to work for you, you say, look, here's what you need to do to take care of that cow or that sheep or to take care of the chickens, okay? You know, you need to feed them once in a while. You need to bathe them once in a while, whatever it may be for certain animals. Those are the instructions that you have for the success of that venture. And then when we come to, again, Joshua 1:8, again, this book of the law, this book of the Torah, this book of the Torah. I mean, it's not law. It's not like these, he has this law code. I think of a law code, I think of like some kind of tax law code, you know, it's got all these entries in there, you know, 1.2.3, like, oh my goodness, this is the most boring thing I can imagine, right? No, these are great instructions. If you keep them, you'll be blessed. This book of the Torah shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. You see, nothing has changed. God's instructions are still just as good today as they ever were. Now, we have to understand, and we will see this as we go through the Torah, that there were certain aspects of it that a certain person could never keep. Right? If you think about it, could Jesus have kept every one of the laws, every one of the commandments? No, he couldn't. You say, well, that's, come on. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? Well, now think about it. There are certain laws that were for Levites. Was Jesus a Levite? No. So they did not apply to him. Was he a woman? No. So there's certain laws that would never apply to Jesus. Okay? So did he have a field that he worked? No. So the law of leaving the corners, that would not apply to him because he didn't have a field to go work. You see? So if you cannot fulfill that situation, if that is not a reality for your life because you're not a woman or you're not a Levite, then those portions of the law will not have any application for you. Right? Just as, you know, I'm not a builder. Okay? I'm not a carpenter. So I'm not really concerned about what the building codes are. Now, the moment I decide to put an extension on my house, then suddenly those laws become applicable in my life. But because there are certain things that you just never would be, if you're a guy, you won't be a girl, then those laws of feminine hygiene and purity, those would never have any application for a man. And so there are parts of the law that were never applicable to Jesus. And so, you know, we have this whole thing of, well, how in the world could Jesus, or you know, how could somebody possibly keep 613 laws? Well, hey guys, as Americans, we have millions of laws. In 2012, they passed 40,000 new laws. Who could possibly keep up with 40,000? And we're complaining about 613? Come on, not so bad. All right, now go with me to Psalm 119. Psalm 119. This is one of the most beautiful passages about the law. In fact, I'm going to just kind of hold your place there. I'm just going to read a couple before we get to Psalm 119. This is Psalm 1:2. But his delight is in the Torah of the Lord, and in his Torah he meditates day and night. Psalm 19, verse 7. The Torah of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The Torah of his God is in his heart. None of his steps shall slide. You see? I delight to do your will, O my God, and your Torah is within my heart. You see, this is what God wanted, that the Torah, the instructions, that driver's manual, if you will, would be in the heart of the person. That's what he was wanting. And now that we have the Holy Spirit, it's easier to do that. But what happens is we've kind of traded for the Holy Spirit to say, well, we got that now, so we don't need the other. You still need the other, just because we're empowered to do it. But to do what? To keep the Torah of God, to keep the commandments, the instructions that God has given us. So then coming to Psalm 119, again, the word Torah. Blessed are the undefiled in the way who walk in the Torah of the Lord. Verse 1. All throughout this book, this chapter, it's talking about the Torah. Open my eyes that I may see wondrous things from your Torah. I mean, this is a whole huge chapter devoted to talking about the wonderful merits of the Torah. Verse 29, remove from me the way of lying and grant me your Torah graciously. Verse 34, give me understanding and I shall keep your Torah. Indeed, I shall observe it with my whole heart. Verse 44, so I shall keep your Torah continually, forever and ever. Verse 55, I remember your name in the night, O Lord, and I keep your Torah. The cords of the wicked have bound me, but I've not forgotten your Torah. Verse 61. Verse 70, their heart is as fat as grease, but I delight in your Torah. Verse 72, the law or Torah of your mouth is better to me than thousands of coins of gold and silver. Verse 77, let your tender mercies come to me that I may live, for your Torah is my delight. Verse 85, the proud have dug pits for me, which is not according to your Torah. You see, it's by knowing what God has told us to do, which he's laid out for us. That's how we can know if we're hitting the mark or we're sinning. We're not hitting the mark. The very word sin means to not hit the Torah, to not hit the mark. And it's to not hit the Torah. Verse 92, unless your Torah had been my delight, I would have perished in my affliction. Right? Now think about it. If you're someone who's you've been a soldier, you've gone through boot camp, basic training, they are drilling into you what to do. Maybe you're not carrying a book, so to speak, but they are drilling into your head the basic instructions. Why? Because they want to beat you up and make your life awful? Well, it may feel that way. But there's actually a higher goal. They want you to live. They want you to live because when you're in the battle, you don't have time to get out your instruction booklet or think, hey, what should I do in this situation? You have to move instinctively. And again, it has to be internalized. So it's now in your heart so that you know what to do without having to think about it. So when I think about how to love my neighbor, I say, oh, well, obviously, loving my neighbor is not murdering him, right? Loving my neighbor is not lying to him. Loving my neighbor is not stealing from him. These are now instinctive. I know to do these things. I shouldn't have to pray about it. You see, there's some things we don't have to pray about because God has already told us, right? We pray about the things that are not clear, that he hasn't told us specifically, but the things he has told us specifically, don't waste your time praying about it. Lord, should I kill this person? Or, murder this person? Maybe not in a court of law, that's different. But, Lord, should I steal from that person? I don't think so. Okay? That you don't want to do that. Should I steal his wife? You don't need to pray about that one, okay? God has already told you what to do, what's going to lead to life. Psalm 119, 109. My life is continually in my hand, yet I do not forget your Torah. Verse 113. I hate the double-minded, but I love your Torah. Verse 126. It is time for you to act, O Lord, for they have regarded your Torah as void. Verse 136. Rivers of water run down from my eyes because men do not keep your Torah. Isn't this true? Think about our world, right? Think about what Satan is doing. Is he not subverting the Torah? Specifically, the Ten Commandments. Okay, the Asarot HaDevorim, right? So he's specifically perverting those. Think about it. You shall have no other Lord God before me. Well, that's happening all the time, right? People have gods in every shape, form, and size you can imagine. You shall not make any graven images. Well, people are doing that. It may be their car. It might be their cell phone.
Or pornography.
It might be pornography, whatever it may be. But we've got that happening. You shouldn't take my name in vain. Well, people do that all the time. And, they say, God damn it. Or they say, Jesus Christ. Why don't they say Buddha? Oh, Buddha. Oh, Muhammad, They're not doing that. They say Jesus Christ. They're taking his name and using it as a curse word. All right? Then there's the fourth commandment. We'll come back to that one in a second. How about don't honor your father and mother? Well, look at what's happening in our homes. People are not honoring their father and mother. Whether at a younger age or even at an older age, we don't honor our parents the way we ought to. And of course, there's murder, there's theft, there's adultery, there's bearing false witness, and there is, of course, coveting, big time, coveting, right? So every one of these, whether you watch TV or you see the movies or you look you're going through the checkout at the store and you get all these magazines, they're all about, sex or perversion of some sort, trying to get you to break one of those good commandments. And then there's the fourth one. Why would Satan pick on 9 out of 10 but not get that last one? Well, of course he's going to pick on that one too. And that one, he was very clever. He just told the church, no, we've changed the day. It's no longer Saturday, it's now Sunday, and so people don't even think about that one. But we will come back to that at a later time. Psalm 119, 142, your righteousness is an everlasting righteousness, and your Torah is truth. You see that? Your Torah is truth. Now, the Torah that God spoke, right? He spoke it. Everybody heard it. Exodus 19. Remember, God came down in smoke. He rested upon the mountain. It was burning and such. And then God himself said the 10 Commandments, and everybody heard it. Everybody heard it. Okay? But then we read that in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. Whoa. Could it be that the Torah and Jesus are kind of like, I'm not saying that they're metaphysically the same exact thing, but there's really not a lot of difference between them. That Jesus is the incarnation he's the Word, right? The Word became flesh. The Word that God spoke, right? And when it says about the prophets, and the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, for example. The word of the Lord came to the prophets of old. That's Jesus, the Word. Okay? the Word. In fact, in Hebrew, the word is dvar. In Greek, it's logos. In Aramaic, it's memra. And if you look at the Targumim, which are the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Scriptures, you'll find that they have inserted, the translators have inserted some passages, just some little phrases. You're like, well, that's not in the Torah. That's not in the Hebrew Scriptures. But they talk about how the memra was there sort of as this intermediary between God and man. He was the agent. And you're like, boy, that sounds like what John said in John 1:1. Right? It's the logos, but in Aramaic, it's the memra. In Hebrew, it's the dvar. And so here, what does Jesus say? I am the way and the truth and the life. Right? So we're reading about the Torah leads to life. The Torah is truth. Right? Jesus is the incarnation. What's a better word? He is the materialization. He's the manifestation, the actualization, the realization of the Torah. Okay? He's the walking, living, breathing Torah. It's cool, isn't it? Like, wow. Okay, so he's not going to change his mind suddenly when we get to the New Testament and say, oh, no, that's over. Sorry, I'm done with that. It was just a trial basis. We were just kind of trying that out for a while. It didn't work out so well, so now I have this whole new thing called grace. What a catastrophe, you guys. We need to get out of our minds that before Jesus, there was the law. But now Jesus came out of grace. Thank you. What do we find here in the Scriptures? We find grace, 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 grace. I was listening to a very popular Bible teacher several weeks ago, and he said, and he was quoting from John, he says, the law came by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. And looked up the passage there. In the Greek, the word but, it's not there. Okay, it's not in the text. Oh my goodness. Okay, so it's not making a contrast. It's saying that the Torah was given by way of Moses, and that the word, if you look at it, in fact, let's go there. Goodness, what is that? John what? Hold on. My brain is thinking that that's in John. There we go, 1:17. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. That's the New King James Version, very popular version. Okay, and again, I never try to throw any particular version under the bus. Right? We all have our issues. Okay, so we all have our issues. But in fact, let's just back up for a second. Okay, I really want you guys to see this. Verse 14. And the word, the logos, the dvar, the memra, the Torah, really, became flesh. Here's the word egeneto. It's to become. It's a transformation kind of word, all right? So the word became transformed flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness of him and cried out, saying, this is he of whom I said, he who comes after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. And of his fullness we have received and grace for grace. For the law, the Greek word nomos, which is the Torah, was given through Moses. Now, there's no punctuation in the Greek. And where it says but, that's not in. That is not in the text. It's neither in the Masoretic or the majority text, nor in the Alexandrian text. It's just not in the text. So it says, for the law or Torah was by way of Moses, was given. Grace and the truth by way of Jesus Christ became the law and or the grace and truth became through Jesus. Okay, so really the distinction here is that Moses received it whether audibly or written. That's how he received it, the Torah. But now it's actually become through Jesus. Okay, it's not the word came, like Joe came to the house yesterday. No, it's Joe became the house. You're like, whoa. Okay, he became something. He was transformed. In other words, the Torah was transformed, had a metamorphosis, if you will, and it was changed dynamically into the person of Jesus, who always was that. Do you follow me? In other words, Moses, he received it verbally, okay? Of course, audibly, which was, of course, written down. That's how he got it. But now we have that same word, that same Torah, now in the flesh. Whoa. Okay? It's really huge. And again, the word there for, it says in the New King James, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. I beg to differ. It's not came. That's a different word. This is the word egeneto, which we just saw in verse 14, that the word became flesh. The word didn't come flesh. No, that would be a bad translation. It became flesh. Transformation. That's what the word become means, right? He became a doctor. He became a pilot. He became a movie star, okay? In other words, you start here, and through some kind of transformation, you become this.
So he came from eternity into time.
Right, so this word that was eternal is now been transformed into flesh. See that? So John is, what's the whole theme of this chapter? Well, my goodness. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Okay, so all of that, he's still talking. It's still the same thing. Still the same thing. And the word became flesh. So that word, the logos, the Torah, the Devar. I mean, if God's Torah is his instructions that he speaks out, that's the Torah. That's the Torah. That's the same as the word. That's the same as the logos. It's the Torah of God has now become flesh. Whoa, doesn't that blow you away? So what do you think? Jesus can say, oh, well, all that I said back then, just scratch that. That was for a different epoch, that was for a different time back in the day, No, it's still relevant. It's still just as good as it's always been. That is what's happening in this verse here in John 1:17. And, I don't have to tell you guys, I don't know why translators do this. I really don't. And again, I don't have all the answers. I'm not the perfect translator. But I can see when there's a word in the English that clearly is not in the Greek. Okay, so in 1:17, John 1:17, for the law, the nomos, the Torah, really, was by way of Moses given. Grace and truth became through Jesus Christ. The word but is not in the text, simply put. So this contrast, this dichotomy that verse makes you think is there is not there. It's just not there. So whether the translators did that intentionally, they did it out of ignorance, if they felt justified because of such and such, I don't know. Maybe it's their doctrines. That's what they hold on to. I don't know why they do it. Okay, I can't tell you why they do it. All I can tell you is the word isn't there. The word "but" is not in the text. It's just not in the text. So again, we need to strike from our minds this notion that well, back then was law, but now we have grace. Again, this idea, and again, this popular teacher said, well, before there was law, but now we have grace. What does God himself say about himself? Go with me to Exodus 34. Exodus 34. This is where Moses says, hey, Lord, you say you were such good friends. Why don't you show me your face? He's like, I can't do that. Sorry, you'll turn to toast if I do that. But here's what I'll do. I'll pass before you. Verse 5, 34:5. Now the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. And the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord. Here's Yahweh, Yahweh, God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth. The very things that Jonah said, I'm not going to Nineveh. He gets there, he's like, I knew you were going to do this. I knew it. Because you are a merciful and gracious God who's long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth. I know that about you, and that's why I didn't go. Right? So to tell me that back in the Old Testament, there was the law, but now we've got grace. Isn't that wonderful? That's completely false, you guys. And it stems from this notion of dispensationalism, that God has been working differently in different dispensations. I know that's going to step on some toes of some people for sure. But why have this systematic understanding if it's not a biblical understanding? All right, let it flow out of the Bible. And God himself says that he's this way. So he hasn't changed anything. It wasn't like he gave the Jews this, the Israelites this Torah, this law. Here, try this for 1,400 years and see how you like it. You'll be begging me to take it away when Jesus comes. I mean, really?
Test drive.
Yeah.
Test drive Torah.
I'm just going to prove that they can't do it for 1,400 years. Boy, they sure will be happy later. Well, whoever wrote Psalm 119 sure didn't see it that way. He's like, man, I love your law. I love your Torah. It's really cool. It's awesome. I love to meditate in it because it's so good. This is, I don't know, we've gotten off track somewhere. We've really gotten off track, and it's very unfortunate that we've gotten this far off the path. I don't know how to tell you, how we've gotten this far off. All I can tell you is that we're far off. Okay, we're like way off, and God's law hasn't changed. Now, just let me qualify that. There are aspects that some people never could keep. Jesus, for example, could never keep the feminine hygiene laws. It's just impossible. He's a guy, right? And he wasn't a Levite, so he was never, those laws that were for the Levites would never, ever apply to him. See? But we're really talking about, the moral laws. Love your neighbor, love the Lord, love your neighbor. If you don't fall in a certain category, then that particular law will not have any application for your life. Unless, of course, aside from getting a sex change. But, if you suddenly become an agriculturalist, well, then suddenly those are going to become applicable. If you become a builder, now the building laws, building codes become applicable to you. But until you enter that profession, they're not applicable to you. See? And I mean, this is why, again, in Psalm 119, he says that your law is truth. Your law is truth. That's verse 142. Your law is truth. Your Torah is truth. And if it's true, then it means that it is always true, right? It's not like just true on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. No, it's true every day. It's true from the beginning of time until, a million gazillion years in the future. It will always be true. If something is true, then it never changes, right? And if his Torah is true, then it must always be true. So I think part of our job is to help communicate and instruct some of our fellow believers in what the Torah, his word is actually saying. Because, again, it's not that somebody's saved or they're not saved. It's just that these little ideas begin to fester, and they begin to cause cancer, and they begin to just get in there under your skin until you're like, something's out of whack. It doesn't quite work, until we're doing things that are not pleasing to the Lord because we don't know any better. Out of ignorance, we start to do things that not only are they not pleasing, but are somehow contrary to the very fabric of time and space, the fabric of the universe. Right? I think that the laws that God has given us, the Torah, this instruction booklet, is not something that he just thought up one day. I think, I'll do this and I'll do that. Yeah, I got some great ones. Good stuff. I'm going to write it down there. No, it's just like, this is how it is. Okay? That's just how it is, right? Just like you can't put diesel in a gas engine. You can try to talk about it and you can philosophize about it. And, if you want, you can do it. But you won't be getting too far if you do that. It will ruin your engine, right? It's just, that's how a gasoline engine works. You cannot put diesel engine in it because it will ruin it. It will ruin it. So we just have to, think that what the instructions that God has given us are part of the fabric of this cosmos that he's created. If we live in accordance with those, things go pretty good. If we go against those and break them, violate them, you're going to have problems. And trust me, God is not mocked. What a man sows, that he shall also reap. Okay? And so we want to do the things that God has told us to do. Psalm 119, verse 153. Consider my affliction and deliver me, for I do not forget your Torah. 163. I hate and abhor lying, but I love your Torah. Great peace have those who love your Torah. 165. And nothing causes them to stumble. 174. I long for your salvation, O Lord, and your Torah is my delight. And there are lots and lots of others. There's lots of others of talking about the Torah, God's instructions to man. God's instructions to man. And it really does bring life. It really does bring life. And doesn't always have to be God's Torah. We see, for example, in Proverbs 3, my son, do not forget my Torah, but let your heart keep my commandments. Again, it means instruction. But in the case of God's instructions, that's what we ought to be keeping. That's what we ought to. That's how we ought to live and regulate our lives. Now, when Paul begins to talk about the Torah, you would almost think that he's against it. He's against the law. That this law of that this handwriting of the law that was against us has been nailed to the cross. But I want you to go with me, and we're going to look in Romans. And we're going to look at the law of sin and death. The law of sin and death. And that's in Romans 8. Romans 8, starting in verse 1. He says, there is now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has made me free from the law of sin and death. Now again, what happens is a lot of teachers will say, well, the law of sin and death was the Mosaic law. But it wasn't. I mean, look, we just went through Psalm 119. We saw how good it was, right? He says, your Torah is truth. So what we have to understand here is that now Paul, using the same word nomos, isn't talking about the Torah of God, but he's talking about a different kind of law. Just like in the world, we have lots of different kinds of laws, and I'm speaking of physical laws. And we have the law of gravity. We have the law of aerodynamics. And the laws go on and on and on. And if you break one of those, in the case of breaking the law of gravity, you better have a good backup plan, right? You better know the law of aerodynamics really well before you try to break the law of gravity, okay? Because if you don't know one, you're not going to break the other. And so Paul is not talking about the law of God as the law of sin and death. It's talking about the law of sin and death, okay? So when you break the Torah, you are now under the law of sin and death. So there's nothing wrong with the Torah. There's nothing wrong with the instructions that God has given. But having broken those, you're now under a different law. You're now under the law of sin and death. Again, just like if you're walking along a precipice, the signs telling you to be careful are good. But the moment you slip and fall off, or you just decide to, throw it all away and you jump off, all those signs become worthless to you. There's nothing wrong with those. They're not bad. But now you're under the law of death because you're under the law of gravity. The law of gravity, if you're high enough, will then lead to another law called the law of death. And you will most certainly die if you break that. So that's where we are. That is that's the misunderstanding that people have been teaching for many years. And I find it most unfortunate. Well, we now come to Genesis. Okay, so we've had a little walkthrough through what is the Torah in a grand scale. We've seen that Jesus is the manifestation, the realization, the actualization of the Torah. He is the Torah. Now he's become flesh. But now we're going to start here in Genesis chapter 1. Of course, Genesis in the Hebrew is the word Bereshit. Bereshit, which means in the beginning. And Genesis is incredibly important. If we did not have Genesis, if you took Genesis out of the Bible, you would still have an incredible history of how God blessed the nation of Israel. You'd have an incredible story, but you wouldn't have that first foundation. You know how sometimes you get to a movie 15 minutes late, and the whole time you're like, what happened? What happened? Right? And you're trying to piece it together. Right? By the end, you're like, okay, I think I know what happened based on how it ended. But I wish I could have seen that, It would have been so good, but it's such a bummer I missed it. And then you're always wondering, like, what really happened? Did I reconstruct it right in my brain? Or am I way off? You don't know. And unfortunately, there is an attack against the book of Genesis, specifically the first 11 chapters. Because that is the ancient history of mankind, and it's right from there that Satan has begun his attack. This is why I'm very thankful to ministries like Answers in Genesis, to ICR, Institute for Creation Research, and others who are fighting the good fight, okay? Because this portion, if the first 11 chapters fall, the rest of it becomes myth as well. And that's why there's such an attack against the foundation, against the beginning of how we got here. Well, it starts in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. All right, that's a pretty big statement. We need to ask, first of all, well, who wrote this? Okay, what is the authorship of the book of Genesis? That's an interesting question. If you are a liberal skeptic, you would say, well, the book of Genesis is comprised, the Torah, they would say, the Pentateuch, has 4 different authors, okay? And here are their names, J, D, E, and P. You're like, who are they? All right, J is from Yahweh or Jehovah, so it's called the Yahwistic source. D is the Deuteronomistic source from Deuteronomy. E is the Elohistic source, or from Elohim, and P is the priestly source. Okay, and the idea is that this is all really later stuff. This was really formulated by a guy named Wellhausen. He's a German scholar, a smart guy, but people at that time in Germany were pretty anti-Semitic, so I wouldn't take my cues from a German anti-Semite from the early 1900s. Maybe they've changed today, okay, but back then I think it's a very bad idea. So he came up with this thing that's called the documentary hypothesis. And it's a hypothesis because guess how much evidence there is for it? You guessed it, 0, okay? It's a hypothesis, right? You know, when you're doing the scientific method, you first, you get a flash of an idea. So you write that down, that's your hypothesis. Then you go and you test it. It becomes, and if you have a little bit of success, it becomes a theory. And if you can prove it enough times that it happens again and again and again in the same circumstances, you can observe it, you can document it, it can become a law. But if you cannot get out of the hypothesis stage to the theory stage where you have something going for it, it falls apart and you abandon the idea. So there's nothing for the documentary hypothesis. Nothing. Now, on the question of who wrote the book of Genesis, I would nuance it just a little bit for you. While I do think it was Moses, I also think it wasn't Moses. How's that for a double answer, huh? Yeah. And it really has to do with the word generation. It has to do with the word generation. We see this in Genesis 6:9, for example. This is, let's see here. Sorry. Hold on. Let's go back to Genesis chapter, Genesis chapter 2. My bad. Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. Okay, verse 4. And it says, this is the history of the heavens and the earth. This is the history of the heavens and the earth. All right, the word here is toledot. And the word toledot means generation, it means account, it means history. So that word where we find a number of times in the scriptures, and specifically the book of Genesis, among other places, but it's talking about this is the account, this is the history of so-and-so, okay? And what we find as we go through the book of Genesis, that this word is used in a number of places, giving us an indication that this document was stitched together by somebody who was taking source documentation and he was stitching it together. I believe, based on the words of Jesus, that, and of course, long-held Jewish understanding, that person was none other than Moses. Okay, and the documents that he was taking were source documents by the authors. Okay, the authors in this case would not be Moses, so to speak. Okay, you might be saying, now wait a second. I thought Moses got all this. Well, certainly that's true for Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Moses received it from God, or he was there and he wrote it down. But he wasn't there for the events that took place in Genesis. So we have a couple of options. We have one is the dictation theory, that, you know, God said, okay, Moses, all right, get your pen, start writing. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, slow down, Lord, slow down. Okay, all right. Oh, he's, of course, going this way. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I got it. What did you say? Okay, so that's one theory, that he was the scribe that God dictated, and that's possible, but I think it's unlikely, based on the internal evidence that we have. And so again, looking at that evidence, what I would suggest is that we have enough evidence to stitch together an understanding showing us that this is not just Moses taking the dictation, but throughout this book. For example, we find again in Genesis 37:2, this is the history of Jacob's period, Joseph being 17. Okay, so and what you have is when you write a scroll, of course you got to roll this thing up, right? On the outside, it's going to say that this is so and so's account, and that is called a colophon. That's called a colophon, and it's basically instead of it being, you know, this is the genealogy of such and such, this is the history of so and so. Go with me to Genesis chapter 5. It says, this is the book of the genealogy of Adam. In the day that God made man, he made him in the likeness of God. So now we're on Adam's account. So in other words, of course, you know, Genesis 1 and 2, probably God wrote specifically, and those were passed down. And then Adam had his account, like he kind of wrote down the family history. And then it gets picked up with Shem. He writes down the family history. Then Noah writes the family history. Or excuse me, then Shem. Then Shem. I was thinking of, who was I thinking of? The other guy. Yes, Seth. There we go. Seth, okay. So, you know, we've got Seth, then Noah, then Shem, right? And then we get to Abraham, right? And then, of course, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph. So each one has his account that he personally dictates or writes it himself. These documents, whether they're written down or they're verbally orally transmitted, which is possible. People could do that just because we've lost the art today because we have our little cell phones, right? But they used to do that. People used to keep huge amounts of poetry in their mind. A bard was a person of old who would have great amount of stories in their brain, and they could say it word for word, and we have generally lost that art today.
Well, the Iliad was done that
the Iliad, exactly. The Iliad by Homer was an oral presentation, but they did it word for word. Mm-hmm. So we have the same thing, and I would suggest that by the time Moses comes along, what did Stephen say about Moses? That he was skilled in all the ways of the Egyptians. This guy had like the ultimate education, okay? I mean, nobody compared to Moses. He got the best of the best of the best. He's the king of the son of the king. He's going to have the best education you can possibly imagine. So, of course, that's going to include Egyptian literature. It's going to include world literature. And it's going to also include learning Egyptian. It almost certainly included learning Babylonian as well. And it may have included Sumerian, though I cannot prove that. But so when Moses comes along, he receives these documents. Now, we don't know what language the documents were in. I get the question all the time. What was the original language before the Tower of Babel? I have no idea. Was it Hebrew? Maybe. I'm inclined to think so, but I cannot prove that from Scripture. I think there are clues that we could just, internally, it's like, because in Hebrew, it would make sense, it would be consistent if it was that way all the way through. But I just, I don't know. Because we do have the New Testament in Greek, but Jesus wasn't speaking Greek to his disciples, guys. Okay, he was speaking Hebrew. So there's an example of where we have the Word of God in Greek, but it was all done in Hebrew. So what was Adam speaking? I don't know. Whatever God was speaking is what Adam was speaking. Okay, was that Hebrew? Maybe. Well, maybe not. Okay, so I just don't get dogmatic about it. I'd like to think it's Hebrew. It would really make me happy if it was Hebrew, because then I'd have a 2-second head start when we get to heaven. Okay, but that's about it. Maybe cut that in half, because you guys learn it pretty fast, right? So who knows? So maybe it was. I'm not going to debate the issue. You can convince me it was Hebrew. You can convince me it wasn't Hebrew, and I'll believe them both. Okay, because I'm like, yep, yep. And at the end of the day, we just don't know. So what I would suggest is, based on the evidence of the colophon, these are the genealogies, or this is the book of, this is the history of so-and-so. That was literally that person's book. That was his story, his account, that either he wrote or he dictated to someone else. So Moses is working with source documentation. Very big difference than the JDE and P theory. The JDE and P theory, the documentary hypothesis, suggests that many centuries after Moses, you had this guy named the redactor. Okay, and he was almost like amazing. Okay, because he had the skills to take these 4 different accounts of the Torah, and he could blend them together. Because there was one source that would really like the name Elohim, and so they're always talking about Elohim. But there was another source that really liked the name Yahweh, so they were always using the name Yahweh. But then there was also this retelling of it. That was the Deuteronomistic source, the D. And then there were the priests, and so they had their own version of this whole thing. And so then this redactor took these 4 different pieces, these 4 different documents, if you will, and then he somehow, miraculously, stitched them together so that now we have one. Wow, it's a miracle. And there are people that write a doctorate dissertation on the documentary hypothesis, and they're trying to show you that, well, look, at this portion the source had to be E, but no, this source had to be J. And you're like, seriously, you're actually writing a doctoral dissertation on this? What a waste of time, people. No, I'm sorry. God is allowed to use his name in different ways. And see, what they'll do is they'll say, well, look, it says in Exodus, God says that the children of Israel did not know my name because I was not known to them by my name, Yahweh. Okay? So you're like, oh my, so something's happening here. And basically, so the argument goes that if they didn't know the name Yahweh, and yet we find it in the Torah, in the book of Genesis, then if they didn't know the name, but it was there, then that's what we call anachronistic, okay? That it really couldn't be there. It had to be put there later by somebody who just happened to like that name and they threw it in, okay? And at first you're like, boy, that's a pretty good theory. But I later discovered as I was reading, it says, go with me to Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4, this is a biggie. 4:26. 4:26. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. So, see, there you go. The name Yahweh, which is the Lord, it wasn't known until this point. Okay? So how in the world could you have the name Yahweh, or that's the J source, in the first 3 chapters? And it's there. How do you explain that? Okay? So again, there seems to be this problem until you go back and you look at the Hebrew and you're like, oh, there's no problem. That's why it's actually kind of cool to know the languages. And look, I'll be the first person to tell you you don't have to know the languages to study the Bible. But I'll also tell you it's really cool if you know the languages when you study the Bible, okay? Because it actually helps. And that's why if you're going to be a serious student of the Bible, like you want to go and teach, you should become familiar with the languages, because a lot of times the commentaries are going to let you down because they just gloss right over things.
Right.
You know why? Why do you gloss over things? Because it's hard. You don't want to rock the boat, okay? You don't want to rock the boat, so you just gloss over it. Gloss just means that you have no clue, and so you don't teach it. All right, that's a fancy way to say it.
Plus, you want to get published.
To gloss over, okay? Right, and of course you want to get published, and if you rock the boat too hard, all right, so in the Hebrew of Genesis 4:26, and it says, when it says, then men began to call on the name of the Lord, that's not in the text. Oh my goodness, what happened? The word men is not in the text. Oh my goodness. So where did that word come from? It came from the mind of the translator. Bummer, huh? Okay, what it actually says, it says, as then, huchal, which we can translate in 2 ways, but it's a passive verb. I'll get to in a second. Likro, which means to call, Beshem Adonai, the name of the Lord. Okay? So, as huchal likro Beshem Adonai. So what does that mean? Well, the word huchal, it comes from the word halal, which can mean one of 2 different things. And it seems kind of strange, but it does mean that. If it's in the hifil, which is the causative, it means to begin. If it's in any of the other verbal paradigms, or the binyanim, it means to profane.
That's what it
It means to profane. Now here, it's not in the active voice where the subject is doing it, but the subject is being acted upon. Okay, so it's a passive verb. And what I discovered is in the book of Ezekiel. I just letting you know, I did the research myself. I have documented all this in Corrupting the Image. You can get Corrupting the Image on Amazon or on my store. Okay, you can watch it online, but I don't go into too much detail in the video because there's not time. So, as huchal, we also find this in the book of Ezekiel, where it means that something was profaned. Okay, it was profaned. So what I would suggest is, instead of then men began to call on the name of the Lord, again, the word men is not in the text. They are guessing that that's what it means, and it's not there. So what was profaned or begun, if you want to take that argument? So you can translate it 2 ways. Then was begun calling on the name of the Lord, but the word men isn't there. But I think the more likely translation, based on my research, is then then the name of the Lord was profaned. And if you look at the Targumim, which are the Aramaic translations, they have this idea of profaning. They talk about it. That's when men began to, that's when people profaned the name of the Lord. Okay, so now we see a very different picture. So, and then another piece of the puzzle is when you come to the book of Ezekiel, God says, And I gave them, that is the nation of Israel, I gave them my name, and they profaned it. All right. So in the very beginning, God is known by his name, Yahweh, because that is his most intimate name, right? I mean, when you don't know somebody, what do you call them? Sir, ma'am, madame, right? Whatever, boss, okay? And in some cultures, it's very much a faux pas to call somebody a superior by their first name. Ooh, never do that, okay? Don't ever do that. In fact, in Hungary, where my wife is from, when a superior, let's say a college professor, for example, and a student, when there a time comes when the professor says, okay, you can call me by my first name, and they go out for a drink to celebrate, okay? Because now they've gotten to know each other well enough that now it's no longer using a different kind of verb or a pronoun to direct to this person, but now you can use the informal with this person. It's kind of similar in Spanish. You have the tú and you have usted, okay? So if I don't know you, I need to use the word usted. If I just say tú, you might think that I'm like some lowlife, even though it's grammatically correct, it's culturally incorrect, okay? So, and it's, and as an American, I'm like, well, I know this person pretty well, but should I use usted or should I use tú, So culturally, I'm not always sure because I didn't grow up in that. Even though grammatically I know what to do, but sometimes and I'm thinking, well, how old is this guy? Do I have to use the more formal or the less formal? Just because he has more money, do I have to use usted, or how does that work? So
It's a good start.
but when in doubt, use the formal. Okay. Now we might think, well, the Bible has that too, right? Thou, oh Lord, thou art so great. But the word thou is actually the informal in English. And the word you is the more formal, okay, in Old English. So really what we see, and in Hebrew, there is no formal or informal. But so God is divulging his name from the beginning. And only in the days of Seth, that's when they start to profane it. That's when calling on the name of the Lord was profaned, okay? It says, then calling on the name of the Lord was profaned. And now this makes sense, because what do we see shortly thereafter? One chapter later, we see that there are Nephilim on the earth, right? Oh, wow, now I get it. And every thought of man was continually bad. Whoa, right? So now it's this downward slope instead of, otherwise you're thinking, wow, suddenly, in the days of Seth, people start calling on, oh, Yahweh, you're so great, thank you. No, it's just the opposite. That's when they start to curse him. That's when calling on his name is profaned. And it only gets worse from there. What a difference, huh? So this whole thing of we see God's name in the first couple chapters of Genesis is because he revealed it. And then by the time we come to Seth, that's when calling on his name is being profaned until it gets worse and worse and worse until the flood goes by. And then we really don't get God's name. Okay? We really don't get it. Abraham knows him as El Shaddai, right? The Almighty One, or you could call it the mountainous one. That's another way that you could translate that from the Akkadian, or it could be the word shed, which is also the breast, so it could be the breasted one. You could take your pick, but just looking at it linguistically, which one actually fits there. So God isn't giving out his name because he's like, well, why would I do that? You probably would do the same thing if people kept making fun of your name and they kept, using it as a curse word. What would you do? Just call me sir. Just call me master. Just call me boss. Okay. I'm not giving you my name because you guys, what do you do with that? You trash it. Forget that.
It's like
My name is pretty cool, right? It's an amazing name, right? And I'm not going to let you drag it through the mud. So you can just call me the Great One, right? You can just call me the All-Powerful. That's all, the Almighty. It's fine. But I'll tell you my name later. So then we fast forward to Sinai, and God says, hey, by the way, my name is Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yahweh. Ooh, wow, right? He's like, hey, oh, and by the way, I'm Yahweh. You can just call me by my first name. It's cool. You don't have to call me that title stuff. You don't have to call me like Mr. President or Mr. God or something like that. You can just call me Yahweh. Because we're like friends now. We're intimate with each other. And so this is part of the misunderstanding that the JD-E&P hypothesis, empty hypothesis, mind you, is built upon. It's built upon thin air. And it's built on a gross misunderstanding of what was actually happening with this name. All right, so I just wanted to give that background into the authorship of the book of Genesis. I believe that it was written by Moses, but Moses used source documentation based on the word toledah, or generations, or account, and he stitched together, and he may have translated, we don't know what language those were, but he certainly, whatever the language was, he brought it up to date, okay? Because languages do evolve. So he made the language current. In fact, there's places where he even says, well, that Jacob went to Beit El, but back in the day it was called, something else, which I forget at the moment. Okay, Luz. They just think it was called Luz, but now it was formerly called Luz, but now it's called Beit El. So you see, there's just a little hint of like, oh wow, okay, so somebody has done some kind of redaction or editing, but the editor doesn't be some nameless person. Who's the most likely guy that would have done it? Moses. And Jesus certainly talks about the books of Moses. Everybody believed Moses did it. Why would we suddenly come along and say, oh, Moses had nothing to do with it? Quite ridiculous. Okay. All right, so that's the authorship. Now we get into some of the cool theology. Woo! I love the book of Genesis. I think it is so foundational. And I'll tell you what, the world wants to destroy it. The world hates this book. And the atheist magazine, American Atheist Magazine, has put it very succinctly that if you destroy Adam and Eve, in the rubble you'll see the sorry remains of the Son of God. Okay? Because look, if you get rid of original sin, you get rid of Adam and Eve, and of course you get rid of creation, direct, literal creation, roughly 6,000 years ago in the period of 6 days. If you get rid of that, there's no Adam and Eve. There's no literal fall. If there's no literal fall, what do you need a Savior for? Right? You just don't need one because you never had a problem in the first place. Right? Maybe you had a bad day, but that's about it. Right? There's no need for some dramatic Savior. And that's why we need to stand strong on the literal interpretation of the Bible. Now, just to set things off on the right foot, I want you to go with me to Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. We don't have to guess, you guys. We really don't. I mean, this should be the end of the discussion, Exodus 20, verse 11. But unfortunately, it's not for some weird reason. Exodus 20, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So what's the big mystery? How long did God take to make the universe? 6 days. God was actually taking his time when he did it in 6 days. Because he could have just gone in a nanosecond, let everything be, whoosh, let everything be fully formed, blues, doggone. It's already like, wow, this is amazing. In half a nanosecond, he made it all. Amazing. But God's like, What's the rush? What's the rush? I've got all the time in the world, Okay. I mean, really, what is time to God? Nothing. It's absolutely nothing. Okay. So, I mean, this whole thing that, God did it in billions of years. Nope. I'm sorry. And we're going to see that doesn't stand up to anything. It really doesn't. So in the beginning, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. So this verse right here, in fact, these first two verses, I could camp out here for a long time. All right. Now, I did write a book on this. It's called The First 6 Days, if you want to check that out. Also on my website, douglashamp.com. Got to have a shameless commercial every now and then. That's our commercial break, to help support this ministry. God did it in 6 literal days. It's called The First 6 Days, if you want to check that out. It's also on YouTube for free if you're, want to check that out. Yeah, whatever. Okay, so here we have God creating the heavens and the earth. Now, I'm going to go into verse 2 just because they really go together. I don't see any distinction between these two verses. The earth was without form and void. All right. Now, this has caused a lot of discussion because there are people that believe in something called the gap theory. The gap theory is this idea that there's a gap of time between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. Right? This is generally held by conservative Christians. Okay, they're conservative Christians that say, well, the geological record tells us that the earth is pretty old. It's millions and billions. So therefore, we somehow have to squeeze this time in there. If you're interested, I did a debate on this recently, back in March. Again, it's on YouTube. You go to YouTube/user/Doug Hamp, and it's right there. It's the creation and restoration theory. Okay, so versus the young earth theory. I, of course, was arguing for the young earth. And so you can see that debate there. If you look at verse 2 is very important. The earth was without form and void. The way that it's written in the Hebrew, it forms a parenthetical statement or a parenthesis. Okay? And it's telling you something about the earth. Just like if you're telling a story, so I was driving my new car today and I saw John, the new car that I've been saving up for 2 years, and I finally went and bought it, that car. So I was driving the car, right? So you stop the flow of the story to tell me something about part of that, some piece there that I need a bit more information. Like I could have said, I was driving my car and I saw Joe and he got in and we went and had a great time. But I want to tell you, this car, the car that I worked so hard for, it was that car. It was the red car, that one. And so what's happening here is in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, because the noun, the earth, is at the beginning of the sentence, and it has the word and in front of it. It's now creating a parenthetical statement. It's creating a discontinuity. All right, and I'm getting that term from Dr. Randall Booth, who has got to be one of the smartest language guys I know. He got a working knowledge of 22 languages, and a good commercial for him as well. If you want to learn Hebrew, you can go and get his course. It's called Living Biblical Hebrew. It's great. It's phenomenal. So he's a good guy. He's a friend of mine. I highly recommend his course. But he points out that when you put the noun at the beginning of a sentence and the word and in front of it, it's creating a discontinuity. Now, in English, we always put the subject at the beginning of a sentence, right? The dog chased the cat, right? That's how we do a sentence. But in Hebrew, it doesn't work that way. You say, chased the dog, the cat, sort of Yoda-like, right? But in English, we don't do that. So in Hebrew, you put the verb first. That's why in Genesis 1:1, it says, Bereshit, in the beginning, bara, created, God, and then followed by our object, the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, I'm now putting the noun or the subject at the beginning, followed by the verb. So that's telling me, okay, pause, stop, take a break. You need some more information. Let me give it to you. And so we could translate it this way. Now, the earth. Now the earth was. Okay, oh, by the way, the earth was, right? So there's different ways to express that. And it now makes sense because you have this kind of big statement, God creates the heavens and the earth, and then you hear about this form and void and darkness on the face of the deep. You're like, what's going on here? So the Gapist would say, well, God created, then Satan sort of had his falling out. God put him on ice for some indefinite period of time, and then he thawed him. And in that time, there was this ruin and restoration period. And so then God recreates planet Earth. That's why it was without form and void, because it was in chaos, right? It was destroyed. But that's not the case. Let me think about it this way. Let's say you start building a house. Like, what are you going to do if you're going to build a house, right? You're going to need lots of cement, right? And if you're going to mix cement, I mean, you could do it by hand, but that's kind of the hard way to do it. You'd probably get a cement mixer, okay? So there you are. You're mixing your cement, right? And you're pouring it out, you're putting your base down. And I come along and I say, hey, what you doing? So I'm building a house. So yeah? Well, what's in there? Well, that's the cement. I go and I look at it. It's all swishing around. I'm like, that's not cement. So I know cement. Cement's hard. Well, I'm just mixing it. I mean, I'm still in the process. So you're not building any house. You're just making some gray goo. You'd say, well, this guy's crazy. You know, I mean, I'm just in the process of building the house right now. Okay. So here we come along. We look at the record, and we're looking at the cement mixer. This is the cement mixer. The earth was without form and void. Okay? Cement in a cement mixer, what shape does it have? Well, it doesn't really have any.
It's a big blob.
It doesn't really have a shape or form. It's just kind of all ooey gooey, right? So the earth at this point is all ooey gooey. And it says, and darkness was on the face of the deep. That the word there is tehom. The word tehom is the primordial water. It's the water in the beginning. So what we get is, in the beginning, God created the heavens. Now the heavens are just this space. It's like this dimension outside of God. Let's for a second. Before God created the heavens and the earth, what was there? Like, where was God? Was he like floating around in space somewhere? It kind of hurts your brain, right? You're like, because when I was a kid, I'm like, was God just like floating in space for like a long time, and then he finally made the earth? And I realized, later, I'm like, well, no, there was no space. Okay. In fact, if you ask even the Big Bang theorists, the ones that are honest, okay, they will tell you that space itself was contained in the dot.
In the what?
In the little dot. Okay. They say that everything in the universe was contained in this tiny little dot, and then it exploded for some God, knows the reason. That all exploded. And you kind of you're thinking, well, all the matter, like all the planets and everything, are squeezed in this little thing, and then they explode into the space that already exists. But no, that's not what the good theorists will tell you. They'll say, no, even space itself was contained in there. You're like, huh? So where was the dot? It was in hyperspace. Okay. That sounds kind of Star Wars-ish, right? Hyperdrive, hyperspace, like where's hyperspace, Well, in a sense, they sort of they're kind of scratching the surface, but obviously they're being very godless about it, but they're kind of scratching the surface of the truth, is that before Genesis 1:1, there was no space, there was God. Wow. Okay, there was God. There was no darkness. There was no differentiation. right? There wasn't like any clocks going tick tock, tick tock. You know, I mean, I can't go there completely, obviously. All I can tell you is that God, who is and was and is to come, there he was, okay, doing whatever he was doing, you know. And so then he creates something that is distinct, yet related, but distinct from himself. Think of the universe like a Coke bottle. He creates this bottle, okay, and then he fills it with a bunch of water. What shape is the water? I don't know. Doesn't have any shape, really. But it's in the space that he created. So the heavens are the space, and the material is water. The material here he calls earth. He calls it earth. It doesn't have any particular shape, just like the cement in the cement mixer doesn't have any particular shape yet. Give him a break, hello, right? He's still making it right here. It's in the cement mixer. And that's why there's darkness over this face of the deep, over this water, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, right? So now we have these waters, and the Holy Spirit is around the water. So it's probably spherical, seems likely, spherical. And the Holy Spirit is outside of it, and it says that it's hovering. The word there in Hebrew is me'achefet. It's like what an eagle stirs up its nest. We get that from Deuteronomy 32, that it's stirring up its nest. It's called brooding, to brood. And it's kind of when, you know, it kind of does a little dance when it's going to sit on its eggs. It goes, you know, that's brooding. So the Holy Spirit is going, right? And so here, what is he doing? He's probably energizing the water. He's putting the waves into the matter. Cool, huh? So, you know, this is all happening in the cement mixer, right? There's no particular shape or form yet. So this is just the very instant of the beginning, okay? Maybe it goes on for a few seconds, a few minutes, I don't know. But, you know, there's a differentiation. Now something that wasn't now is. And so that is when time begins. There was no time up until this. The angels were not before this. There was only God. You know, Satan and the angels weren't hanging out saying, hey, God, what are we going to do tomorrow? All right? No. There's just God. Okay? And until he begins to create something, there's no distinction. There's no change. It's just God. And then he begins the process of creation. And that is when time begins. Okay? And so the angels are created probably on day 2 or 3. I'll probably talk about that next week. And of course, Satan's fall happens after the fact, not before. After the fact. I will talk about that. If you're interested in that, I have a video on that, okay? And it's called The Angelic Domain and the Fall of Satan, okay? Available on YouTube or douglashamp.com/store. So you can check those out. All right, we're going to have to end there for today. There's a lot to talk about. This is why we're getting a head start, okay? Because if I had to cover 6 chapters in 1 week, I'd probably go crazy. But there's so much to talk about, and I wanted to get a jump start on it, all right? I do encourage you, this Saturday is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the Day of Covering. If you can do it, I highly recommend that you fast. You can probably do it once a year, okay? Okay. So if there's ever a day that you're supposed to fast, that's the day to do it.
Starting Friday evening.
Starting Friday evening when the sun goes down till Saturday evening. You got to wait an hour after the sun goes down on Saturday. So it's a 25-hour fast. You can probably do it, okay? And use the day to reflect, to rest, to pray, to read the Word, okay? Maybe check out a Messianic synagogue, okay? And devote that day to God, because that is the day that he's opening the books, okay? So it's, you know, it's biblical. God told us to do it. I recommend that you do it. I'm going to do it. Okay, well, let's go ahead and take questions. Okay, yes.
Who were the Nephilim?
Okay, that's for a later chapter. The Nephilim comes later. Okay, good try. Yes.
You talk about the languages, pre-Hebrew. I know, like in Hezekiah's tunnel, they have that Paleoglyphic or Syro-Phoenician Hebrew.
It's a Paleo Hebrew. That is Hebrew.
Okay.
If the language is Hebrew, the writing script is a variation, and then later it would be supplanted by the Aramaic script. Okay, same language, different script.
Well, the script we have in the Masoretic text,
That's an Aramaic script.
that's Aramaic script.
Yeah, when I say script, I mean letters.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, just like we write English with Latin letters. You could, for example, in Spanish, you write with Latin letters, but you can actually write Spanish with Hebrew letters. It's called Ladino. I checked it out and I read it. I'm like, wow, this is Spanish, but with Hebrew letters. How weird, you know? But it was Spanish. Okay, so you could write English with Hebrew letters. It's very possible. Okay?
Just say the phonetic form.
Well, I mean, it's the same language, what we're speaking, but using a different writing system. Like, for example, Turkish used to be written with the Arabic script, and then they switched it to the Indo-European or the Latin script because it's so much easier. So
The alphabet has to match. I mean, it has to be the same amount. Or how you're gonna have
you can modify. Yeah. In fact, just like in Spanish, you have accents. We don't have accents in English, but you have accents in Spanish, accents in French. You have things called diacritics. For example, in German, you have the umlaut, where you have the little two dots over the U. So we don't have that in English, but it's still a Latin-based script. Okay, it's still a Latin script, but it's modified from Latin to that language. Okay, just like it's modified in English to work with English. You see, we tend to think that it's English, but it's not. It's a Latin script. Yeah.
Since we're on that subject, researched a lot for years, but that actual tracing the languages, I remember I don't know if it had to do with those who are coming against intelligent design or just, God and creation, the Bible, but the languages, is there something that show, I'm trying to say that they was all one the same, but that can't be because if the story of Babel is true, it is.
So the question,
God created it all in one.
what's the question exactly?
What evidence is there to show that roots trace back to different, not one? I've heard those try to say it all came from
Okay.
one.
Well, that's a very complex question. Looking at the origin of languages, but I mean there is some literature suggesting that there was originally one language. I mean, if you think about it, just logically, even if we evolved, and we started out as, Adam and Eve 250 million years ago, or whatever, 250,000 years ago, as the evolutionists suggest, even if we evolved, we started with one language, right? So, I mean, to say that there were, what people have trouble with is that they were all changed at this Tower of Babel event. So I think that's the real crux of the matter, in my opinion.
Well, I'm saying they can't trace back to we had started with one, of course.
Yes.
But if that was true, I believe that they can't trace back to one because, if I understand it correctly, God at that time just created on the spot several different ones.
Yeah, it would seem that he, created or modified or whatever you want to call it. And it's true. A lot of languages have no apparent connection between them. And you can't say that they all came from Latin and those all came from something else. They seem to be completely different, unique languages that don't have any crossover between them. So, yeah, so that would, in our opinion, that would suggest that something miraculous, albeit a bummer, happened at a specific time. So that's a complex argument, but yeah.
Okay, the name of God, Yahweh,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Does it mean I am?
Yahweh means, well, he says, first of all, he reveals himself to Moses as Eheye Asher Eheye, I am that I am. And then he says, tell the children of Israel that I am, okay, Eheye, sent you. And then he says, tell them my name is Yud He Vav He Yahweh. And probably what that is coming from is from three Hebrew words: Haya, which is was, he was; Hove, he is; Yihye, he will be. Okay, so if you then combine those three, you get one composite word, which is Yahweh. So that's where it comes from.
We're still on.
We're still on. We still got a couple more minutes. Yeah.
I had a question about the Day of Atonement. Does it say in the Word for us to fast, or
Does it, concerning the Day of Atonement, does it tell us to fast?
Yes.
It tells us to afflict our souls and to not have any fun that day. It does. Okay. Yeah, it tells you if you don't afflict your soul, you're going to be cut off from your people.
does it still have to do with appetite?
Well,
Nefesh?
you know, I'll tell you what.
My soul.
If you want me to afflict my soul and I still get to have a feast all day, like, what am I really, I mean, okay, there's probably a few other things, if you're married, you abstain from relations, but my goodness, I can probably go longer without that than I can without food, So not having food for a day, that's afflicting your soul. Yeah. I mean, I guess you could, get a whip and beat yourself, but we don't see any evidence of that happening. It's universally accepted as a fast. Yeah, so
Does it always fall on the same day every year?
it always falls on the same day in the biblical calendar. Yes, yeah, it's always it's the 10th of the 7th month. So we're in Tishri, right? The first of the month was the Feast of Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah, right? It was the Yom Teruot, right? No one knows the day or the hour. We talked about that last week when we talked about the feasts. And so this is when God is going to open the books. Where do we see that? Matthew 25, Daniel chapter 7. That's when the books are opened. And it's the time that the king is enthroned. Oh my goodness. What do you know? So just like we see in Matthew 25 and we see in Daniel chapter 7. So it's very biblical. It's very biblical. And this is the time when you should fast. If you fast other times during the year, hey, great, more power to you. But the one time God actually tells you to fast is here. Okay, and he even talks about in Isaiah 58, he's saying, oh, you guys, you're fasting, but you're not doing that for me. You're not doing it for me, right? And he even tells you what's even better than a fast: to go take care of the poor and the widows and the orphans. Do those things. That's what I want. So only once a year are you commanded to afflict your soul. Because think about it. If you know that your case is going before the judge on that day, and there's any hint that you could be guilty, think you're going to be like out partying, having a great time, you'll be like sweating bullets. You're like, oh, am I going to be innocent or guilty? Innocent or guilty? Okay. Now, we're in Jesus. I get that. I get it. Okay. So don't stress. Just be obedient. Okay. He said to do it. I suggest we do it. I'm not going to say you're not like a Christian or whatever. You don't, because most Christians don't. Okay. But all I can tell you is that God said to do it. So why not do it?
So my thing, so it's always on the 4th of October every year?
No.
Lunar calendar.
The lunar calendar. Not the
Biblical calendar.
Yeah. This October is the Julian calendar, the Gregorian calendar. We are what we're talking about is the lunar calendar, which is the biblical calendar. Just look online. Okay, that's what I would do. That's what I do. Because I can't remember. I just look online. All right. Okay. Well, we're just about out of time, you guys. I want to just leave you with this. All right. Yevarechecha Adonai ve'yishmerecha, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chunecha, Yisa Adonai panav elecha ve'yasem lecha shalom. All right, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. All right. Until next time, God bless.